Hey everybody, my name is Jesaya, and I'd like to welcome you all back to the Voice of Vault podcast, McMaster University's meme and media podcast. Today we're continuing on from our previous podcasts on the topic of deconstruction, specifically as it pertains to anime and manga. And if you'll remember, the last two podcasts, in the first podcast we talked about what deconstruction is, so I advise you go listen to that if you don't know what deconstruction is. We talked a little bit about Madoka Magica, shoujo anime, and some other things like that. In the second podcast, we talked specifically about comedy and One Punch Man, and specifically how deconstruction works in that show. Advise you again to look at that. In this podcast, me and Andrew talk about something a bit more contentious between us, and that is the topic of isekai and deconstruction. I won't spoil too much, but basically we're going to talk about some interesting things in this podcast, and I hope you all enjoy. So, without further ado, we'll get right into the podcast. Andrew?
Overall, I can agree with your assessment. One Punch Man definitely seems to be deconstructing the relationship of power and meaning in the superhero genre. I feel with your next example, things are going to be a little bit more contentious between us. I'm at least skeptical of what you're going to bring to the table here, but go ahead. Tell me what you're going to talk about next.
So the next thing that we wanted to talk about, and I've been waiting eagerly to talk about this for a while, is isekai. And for those of you who aren't indoctrinated in the whole anime thing, isekai is basically a person from our world, which is to say, this reality, the one that we're both inhabiting right now, to another world, whether that be a fantasy world, a high world, etc. The main point is that we're traveling from here and now to somewhere very far off, and specifically, isekai specifically is interesting because I find it to be a bit of a non-genre. What I mean by that is that it kind of hitches off of other genres in order to make its, I don't know, it seems to be more of a plot device that is common to a bunch of shows rather than an actual genre. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
So yeah, I think you've touched upon one of the things that I want to get at here, which is this idea that there are two types of isekai. Isekai as pretense, and then isekai as genre. So isekai's pretense is like what you just said, where it is nothing but an inciting incident that delivers a setting. So think, good example of this might not be necessarily isekai, but I at least consider it proto-isekai on the development of the genre. Log Horizon. Log Horizon, all of these individuals transported to an MMORPG game that they had been playing. They don't know how they got there, they don't know why they're there, and at some point, at least in the first two seasons, they really don't care. It's just, now it's a narrative taking place in a game, and the whole aspect of being transported to the game falls pretty much out of the main plot.
So that's pretense, is what you're saying.
Yeah, so that would be, isekai, as pretense. Isekai as genre is a little bit more difficult because I haven't seen too much of contemporary isekai. But isekai as genre deals with a far bigger picture that I'd argue is actually built out of the harem genre. So nowadays, we don't actually see as much harem, I'd argue, as we used to see back in the 2000s, after, Love Hina and the other major harems. And I think part of that is that we've been seeing the power dynamic, pseudo-sexual fantasy develop into the isekai. And I think that a very important bridgeway is the proto-isekai, not necessarily full isekai, but proto-isekai of Sword Art Online. Now, Sword Art Online sold itself as a trapped in the game, which is similar in isekai, but more of an action story. But what the author, that 13-year-old boy, figured out quite correctly is that at the heart of many individuals who watch Sword Art Online, they didn't actually care that much about the game. Kirito, moving through Sword Art Online, actually goes through most of the stages of what people would expect to find in their lives. He fulfills challenges, proves himself, gets a girl, even gets a kid. They have their own little vacation getaway. And I think that one of the things that Sword Art Online paved the way for is this idea of using video games as this escapist power fantasy, sexual fantasy, overall life fulfillment fantasy tool. And I think that there exists a genre of isekai now, where you are transported away to this fantasy or video game-esque place. And the real narrative that's undergoing there is something of a action, harem, slice of life, where the main protagonist, who was unsatisfied in our real world, is now fulfilling all of the entitlements and expectations of life in this new fantasy world. And all he needed was just the second chance and the right setup. And that, I'd say, would be the real meat of what people mean when they mean isekai.
I definitely see where you're coming from, and that is underlying isekai usually is understood as, because oftentimes an isekai is this, like you said, a person who is unfulfilled. They're a NEET, they live at home, go to school, they don't have a job, they die or something, right? And they get resurrected to this place where suddenly they have the ability to do whatever they want. You pass judgment on isekai in such a general term. I ask that you take a very close look at what an isekai entails, and that is the plot device of an isekai, is what I would say. And this device is that an isekai is about a genre, right? Whether that be, let's say, fantasy, or I said sci-fi, fantasy, steampunk, whatever you want to say, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have an established genre with established rules and conventions which everybody understands, right? For example, in most isekai about fantasy and video games, there's understandings of class types and and items and health and spells and etc. All these things, right? Interesting part here is that the isekai takes a protagonist, right, who real world, and throws them into this new environment and asks them to respond to it. So this is basically what isekai is all about. This is not necessarily the conventions of harem, but the idea of moving a person from the real to the fantastic, right? And they are continuing as this real person, except in the fantastic. How an isekai responds to that, right, can be a matter of deconstruction or not deconstruction. This fundamental plot device, which is taking a real person and putting it into that person into the unreal, and they use it as a tool in order to deconstruct the genre that they're putting this real person into, because it's a very powerful tool to random individual person that the audience is identifying with, and just put them in this random ass area and have them deal with it. Of course, that's not to say that there aren't those power trip type isekai, but I'll let you have your own,
So yeah, in terms of deconstructing the isekai, and by extension, I'm going to talk about the harem genre, because especially after Madoka, there was a lot of talk about, well, why don't we have a harem deconstruction? Why can't we deconstruct this most staple, sad to say, staple of the anime scene, the harem genre? And I think that there are a few issues here. First of all, I'd argue that, like slice of life, harem is very much detached from the idea, detached not from story. There are still events linked by cause and effect, but there is a lack of form to them. In some ways, slice of life is to anime the way that a home video to cinema. They are capturing events almost for documentation, and they are assembled, of course, coherently. The person making a home video presses the record button in such a way to capture what they consider to be significant enough events in the individual's life. But one of the things at the heart of story is this idea of change. There is an inciting incident that throws the main characters out of equilibrium, and they spend the time of the story trying to bring things to a quote-unquote normal, trying to find resolution. Harem and isekai, by and large, this inciting incident is either being transported to a different world or multiple women who want sexual attention from you. And one reason that you can't deconstruct is that maybe it might just be as simple as those situations are passive. There is no accepting the call in isekai and the harem. You're just thrown into it. So that easy cudgel that Eva and Madoka use, you just can't use it. And maybe it's as simple as that. On the other hand, it might be the fact that the change and the problem, there really isn't one at the heart of it. The whole being brought to a different world is either pretense or either devolves from pretense into the equivalent of a home video of this individual who was unsatisfied in life just finding basic satisfaction. And we witness that. And that doesn't have scenes and obligatory scenes and conventions to be played with, though it does, of course, have implicit content to it. But I feel that this is the dicey one. To deconstruct some of that content can be almost antagonistic to the viewer. Like, why would someone want to watch a harem? I don't think that you can deconstruct that and come away with a positive tale of the harem genre. I'm just gonna say that. And likewise, the power fantasy isekai, you deconstruct that, I think you're just going to dive into why someone would want to watch this, which I think at its heart speaks to a lot of human fragility, isolation, and loneliness, and would be a very bold project, but in some ways almost too great a task. And for that reason, you only see examples of these genres, not full-fledged deconstruction. That was my thought process going into this talk, but I'm willing to hear what you think of the matter.
You know what? I absolutely agree with everything that you're saying, which I think you might be surprised to hear, because I did say that I thought that there's a deconstructive element to isekai, but I'll explain that, right? Because my thought process and your thought process actually each other. So your thought process, from what I understand, is that, I guess, substance. There's no internal dialogue or rhythm or columns. Not columns. There's no pillars behind the ideas or meanings or conventions. There's no meaning, I guess, that we can subvert here. So, isekai, for example, I guess we could use Sword Art Online, right? Point of the show.
I would still consider Sword Art to be proto-isekai. Okay. It most certainly helped forge the genre, but is not probably the best example.
And I honestly haven't watched enough good isekai or firm examples of isekai in order to, give like a very firm analysis, but my assumption...
Honestly, I keep thinking back to that just meme image of the dog with all of the other dogs bowing down to them and the soldier saluting them, and it's captioned with like every woman, all enemies, and then it's like the soldier saluting is God, and then it's just the isekai protagonist right at the center. And like Sword Art is approaching that, but the animes that are that, like that's isekai.
Right. Okay, so
the Sword Art for its time was very much like you could have put like Kirito in the center of those dogs, and the meme would work quite well. But I think that we've gone even further. I think there's just been a deeper development in terms of the level of the power fantasy.
I agree with that point, right? Because there are a lot of isekais which do fulfill that power fantasy. I would dare say that a lot of isekai and a lot of harem, for example, are purely utilitarian in nature, if you know what I mean.
I'd also say that Sword Art, being produced by a 13-year-old kid, it's not very focused. It touches on a lot of different things, but one of the things that Geniusly did was touch upon this idea of what if our protagonist just enjoys the entitlements of life. A lot of the isekais come after Sword Art. They can really focus in on that, satisfy all of the deepest desires that the target audience is seeking to have fulfilled.
Right. These are all good points about exactly why we can't exactly, but I would argue that isekai is not solid enough as a genre in terms of its conventions, for example. And I'll explain why I mean that. And it's because isekai often like to hitchhike onto other genres, like we talked about earlier, the genre of fantasy. My point that isekai is not so much a genre that can be deconstructed, but rather a tool that can be used to deconstruct. I'll give examples in Konosuba, but because it lies on the premise that there's this person who lives in the real and we're moving him to the unreal. We have the opportunity, or the writers have the opportunity, to have him react or respond or develop himself in response to that change in environment. He does so can make a commentary not only about the genre that is working, that the isekai is working with, for example, fantasy in the case of Konosuba, more broadly on the audience themselves. So in Konosuba, you've got your basic isekai premise, right? You've got a person, this NEET, who lives at home. He's on his way back from bus. He thinks he gets hit by a car, but he really just has a heart attack on the side of the road.
Is this undermining the convention there of the truck as being the great deliverer?
Yes, well, it kind of, because he sees himself as being a hero and pushing this girl to safety, but really this truck is going like 5 miles an hour, looking properly, and he had a heart attack and peed himself on the side of the road. Right, so Konosuba immediately in that sense, because it's looking at the convention but in deconstructing it. So in a sense it is kind of a deconstruction of isekai, but I'm more interested in how it uses this transition from the real to the unreal to look at the fantasy genre, and does this by the characterization of the people it's working with, right? So he goes into the afterworld and he meets this goddess, and the goddess is like, "Oh, you want to direct it into this other world where they need to defeat the demon king?" He of course says yes.
The show knows the conventions.
Very clearly knows the conventions. He of course says yes. Why not? And he gets one wish, and he wishes for the goddess. Right, so basically,
this show really knows its conventions.
He's and the funny part is that it turns out that the goddess is totally useless in this new world, right? So she's all powerful, all knowing, in the afterlife. But when she's put into in the mortal realm, she's absolutely useless. Code works with this in quite a few different ways, right? It subverts the expectation of the better person, etc., in this new world, right? Because this NEET, right, never develops as a character. Entire stay in this other world, he's the same lazy, good for nothing sort of terrible person that he was at the beginning, socially inept, etc. People around him who also come from the other world, who are doing quite well for themselves. Right, there's this prototypical gigantic sword who's like, oh, I came from Earth as well, and then this guy's stuck wondering like, why am I not like that, right? Overall, Konosuba is the main point of Konosuba is to take a look at the fantasy genre as a whole, right? So the conventions of what it means to be a fantasy, and what it means to be a hero within the fantasy genre, and introducing this hero that comes from our world, right? But I won't talk too much about Konosuba because you did say that you haven't watched it yet, and I highly recommend you watch it because it's really funny. It's great.
Okay.
Overlord is a really interesting example of an isekai, right? Because it's almost he's the Overlord person here. I forget what he calls himself because it's really complicated.
I call him Mr. Skeletal. So
he's not your typical hero because he's not a hero, and in addition to that, he's super overpowered. Basically, nothing can stand in his way. Not on the same level as Saitama, mind you, but enough to subvert our expectations of the battle. So, there's something terrible happens. He's like, "Snap! Okay, I got this." Right? Mm-hmm. Since we already see kind of that meaning deconstruction that I was talking about earlier, but it doesn't hammer in on that point. Talk more specifically on, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Was I found it interesting how in this particular anime, many isekai, right? It's centers in on the thoughts and ideas of this one character is real, the real character, the character that comes from the other world, right? Mm-hmm. Person responds to it. In this case, right? So I'll preface by saying, in the case of Konosuba, for example, right? The person behaves as they did in the other world. So they act lazy, inept, incompetent, socially, like just terrible, right? So they're a non-hero right from the beginning. Construction in itself, because it's showing that in reality, we wouldn't handle these situations as well as we think we would. Mm-hmm. Lord has a different take on it. Instead of espousing his actual emotions, feelings, thoughts on certain subjects, he has the idea to play the role that he's been assigned in this new world, which I think is the most interesting aspect of this. We're looking at a different way of negotiating this isekai formula, which is he understands the conventions of the world that he's entering because he's well versed in the of what he's been playing as his video game for years, right? Mm-hmm. That knowledge as a way to calibrate his own response to the environment around him. So in a sense, it's making a commentary about would respond to an isekai situation. Part of the deconstructive moment that we see in Overlord, but I'll let you take it from here.
So yeah, I'm thinking about Konosuba for a bit, and of course it very much depends on how much your characterization lines up with what I'm thinking of it, but it seems like you might actually be onto something with Konosuba in terms of it does seem to actually deconstruct the content genre of isekai, as I said. And its genius is just simply the fact that it shows the protagonist unchanged by being brought to the new world. They are unsatisfied, even in this new world. But it's a joke, kind of, so it's not pointed, necessarily. And so, I feel like Konosuba probably succeeds in terms of making a good story on that premise. But I can imagine that they're not really diving into anything there. Our main character is the butt of the joke, I imagine.
It's certainly not your quintessential isekai, right? Like, it's doing things not how our trip isekais that you described do them. and I think that's partially why I think it works as a deconstruction, not only of isekai but of other genres quite well.
Mm-hmm. Now, as to Overlord, things are a bit interesting since you want to examine it from the perspective of how the protagonist engages with the new world coming from the old. Now, of course, we don't have pretty much any knowledge of what the old world is, at least early on, to our main character, outside of the fact that he works a relatively straightforward job. It's exhausting, and it seems to imply that he doesn't find fulfillment doing it. For he says pretty early on he has no interest in finding an out and returning to the ordinary world. Now, in terms of how he chooses to play his character, it's kind of interesting because I processed it as him playing the role in the way that if you were to be thrown into, well, let's assume that you were doing, this was some kind of joke, and you were in theater, and you enter a room, and all of these people are acting this part, and pretend that you have a role in the part. Well, you would obviously take an action such that you would play the role with them. I feel most people would try to fit in. They wouldn't want to be the stick in the mud or the odd man out that doesn't conform to the rest of the people in the room. And this is an intro psych thing. You can learn this in intro psych about how you can literally have smoke come out of a room adjacent, but so far as people will sit in the room as it fills with smoke, no one will leave. Now, to get back to this idea of Overlord, he really does behave kind of, as soon as the NPCs start playing the role, he feels, I processed it as he feels kind of obliged to fill the role to a certain extent. He doesn't want to, meet that human risk of not belonging in the scenario, whatever the scenario may be.
Yep.
And so he goes along with it. And there's some interest there in terms of his thought process, but his thought process doesn't strike me as too captivating. For example, he was helped in the game by a noble person and decides to do the same, but then in the process mentions how he doesn't care about killing people, about how it doesn't pain him in any way. Honestly, much of the way the protagonist acts, I think of relative to Hellsing, in terms of Hellsing being kind of almost like the go-to example of what a badass character execution looks like. And Overlord is better than Kirito, but I would not write home about Mr. Skeletal's performance.
Yeah. Do you think that kind of Overlord is not the best example of a deconstructive anime, or a deconstructive isekai, because aiming to actually subvert genre, but kind of supports it?
I saw Overlord as isekai. Like, it's, to me, seemed like a pretty clear example of this. You have these people literally swearing fealty to our protagonist, Mr. Skeletal, and it is almost, of a personal level, is an uncomfortable level of power fantasy, those scenes. See, I could handle everything else, but those scenes specifically personally rub me the wrong.
I get it. I have
no desire for people to ever get on their knees before me. That's just... But go on.
This is partially why I wanted to switch to Konosuba, because I realized that Overlord is not the best example of a isekai that works as a deconstruction, right? What I wanted to emphasize in Overlord was that there are various responses that the protagonist has to meeting the new environment change, right? And this is the potential that isekai has. In the case of Konosuba, we see no change. In the case of Overlord, we see that he decides to play out the role, which in a sense, tiny deconstruction, because it's acknowledging the fact that, you know, he's not this like benevolent overlord, king, hero, god figure that, you know, he's purported to be, but actually just this very insecure person on the inside, right?
He's a spoopity doopity Mr. Skeletal. I get to your point, however, this idea that the isekai convention, the more isekai as pretense, is a very useful tool. I want to ask you, what distinguishes it from just the straightforward hero's journey? Because at the transition point between the beginning third and the middle third of a traditional hero's journey story, we have the transition from the ordinary world to the extraordinary world. And have you seen Made in Abyss?
I have read a little bit of it, but I haven't gotten too deep into it, partially because you guys scared me off of it.
You've gotten to the bit where they enter the abyss.
Oh no, I haven't gotten to that part.
Okay, well, I'm still gonna pretend you did. So,
right.
Pretty straightforward. The beginning third essentially deals with these characters' life in the ordinary world. We get a nice taste of the ordinary world. We have an inciting incident in terms of the meeting of this creature with our main character, Rico. And then we have, in this case, we have a compound inciting incident. That is one part of the inciting incident, is finding out who Reg is and getting him home. And the other part is contact that Rico has with the remaining records from her mother. And those two inciting incidents drive them to move, not pretty gung-ho from Rico's perspective, but not necessarily gung-ho from Reg's perspective, from the ordinary to the extraordinary world. What benefit is isekai transporting someone from the ordinary world to the extraordinary world? What is the distinction between that transition and the transition that just occurs in normal hero's journey-based stories like Made in Abyss?
It's interesting that you bring this up, because in essence, right, the format of the hero's journey remains the same. I would argue that the hero's journey basically applies to isekai, right? However, there is a slight difference here in that I use Naruto as an example, because Naruto is a pretty standard hero's journey. I mean, all shonen are, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have a person who inhabits a world, but he inhabits a very, not ideal position in life, right? He develops as a character. He goes into the extraordinary, right? Whether that be a battle with this person he's never, seen or whatever. He learning the ninja arts, and he eventually conquers it and returns back to, the normal, right?
Mm-hmm.
The difference here is that in an isekai, we have a transportation between the real and the unreal, like I've been saying, that inhibits our reality, right? It inhabits our reality, right? Has our cultural preconditions, notions, etc. Our own fundamental human response to things, right? Not a fantasy or a fantastic hero response.
Mm-hmm.
And is placed through this hero's journey into a place which is radically different, right? In a traditional hero's journey, for example, a character who understands for their entire life in the world where they inhabit, right? And is transported, not transported, but experiences something very different in that world. We are introducing someone from our world, or I guess by an extension, us, right? We are introducing ourselves into another world and asking ourselves how we would respond, right? So in isekai, it's just a very, it's a much more poignant way of delivering the hero's journey, because instead of implying the audience's connection to protagonist as in a traditional hero's journey, the audience is the protagonist, quite literally, right? This literally could be you, because this is a real person who is being transported to a fantastic world. How would you respond in a similar way, or would you not respond in a similar way? And the way that the writers respond to this change in stimulus, the way that they decide to interpret how a human exists, various trials, tribulations, etc., molds how they want the audience to perceive themselves, how they want the audience to pick up on, what they would do in that scenario. So that's why I think the main distinction between two things, and I think it's a very useful distinction to make. So thank you for bringing up that point.
I see what you're getting at in terms of the way that the isekai pretense. Remember, we're talking about the pretense in terms of your argument. It does focus in this idea of taking people from literally our ordinary world to literally an extraordinary world.
Right. It's very clear in that sense.
And it is exceptionally fast. It is literally an opening scene.
Yeah.
So much as what we're talking about.
Like in Made in Abyss, it's not like 1/3 of the story. It's first episode, first 10 minutes, the guy dies and he is resurrected in a new world.
And I guess I see your argument in terms of what you're getting at potential. I guess at the heart of my criticism is that I just don't see isekai as pretense, as something that's necessarily like either utilized or like dissected or dealt with in such a way as you mention its potentials. When I think of isekai, I still think of, as I said, isekai as genre, this amalgamation of the lessons of the harem genre and the slice of life genre and shonen action and the lessons of Sword Art Online and this fundamentally morally questionable pursuit of a surrogate life and a life outside of the one that people are currently living. So while I can agree with you in the hypothetical, I still think in concrete terms, outside of Konosuba, which seems to be kind of more taking the piss out of the idea that a life in a new world would be better, that if you're just a lazy degenerate, you're still going to be a lazy degenerate in your new fantasy land. Like, outside of that, which is played with pretty decently heavy comedy throughout, I don't see, like, isekai deconstruction itself as a fruitful endeavor. Though I see what you mean in terms of the potential for this narrative, scene type, this convention to be utilized. I'll
give you some more examples that you may or may not have heard of before. That are very much isekai, at least in the pretense, right?
Well, I guess the disagreement here is that you're talking about the pretense, and I get that, but yeah. I think about isekai as genre,
right.
And I think you agree with me on that.
I would argue that there's not enough substance to isekai to make it effectively a genre. I look at isekai more as a plot device that has gathered a following, right? Because it hitchhikes off of other genres, obviously, right?
I still think that there is... This is a hard one, because I have actually gone back and forth on the idea. I am leaning towards the idea that isekai is like a genre in the way that harem is a genre, in the way that slice of life is a genre, in that they're not necessarily story. They're not story in the traditional sense. There is no overarching change that is dealt with. If you were to analyze the story, you'd come away with a story that doesn't work, to use a story grid term. The story just doesn't work. There's no narrative velocity, there's no twist, there's no turn, there's no zagging when there's zigging, everything's just pretty linear in a line that seems to not aim anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sense I get you. Like that sense I get that there really isn't actually a story at the heart of these genres. But I do think there are conventions and obligatory scenes, so much as they are defined by not having internal dynamics and change.
Right.
And therefore, I do think that they meet some loose definition of genre. Not in the way that, like, real stories like Mahou Shoujo and Shonen and Mecha are genres, but in this very anime-specific way, where there exist these genres of stories that aren't actually good story, to put it bluntly.
Right. Actually, okay, so we have to wrap up because we're running out of time. In fact, I think we're like 10 to 15 to maybe 20 minutes over time.
Tis always the case.
It's always nice talking with you, man. But
it's good to be on, as always, good to be on.
There's one thing I wanted to make the distinction of to wrap up this whole isekai thing. And that is where to draw the line between isekai as pretense and isekai as genre.
I think that that's relatively clear, actually. I think that at the heart of it is isekai being utilized alongside a desire fulfillment for wants and needs. A good example of this might be Jumanji, the movie, which has the pretense of isekai. They are literally transported into a game. But I would not be comfortable at all calling it isekai in the anime sense, because they are like it's a horror, borderline horror. There's a kind of like horror action element there of them really not wanting to be there and really wanting to get out. I think that what defines isekai as genre is fundamentally a desire to be there, a satisfaction from being there, a kind of joy with getting a chance to live life again. Those themes come through in the genre isekai.
I see it. I understand now. I will say that there are a couple shows that I could name that I think would subvert that idea. But honestly, if I were to get into it, we'd be on for another half hour. Guys, I'd like to say thank you for watching. Thank you, Andrew, for coming on. It was a pleasure.
Always, the pleasure's mine.
Of course. Thank you guys, obviously, for listening. If you like this podcast and you'd like to listen to more, we have more on our YouTube and on our website. I think we have other things on our Discord, Twitter, etc., but I'm not sure how much we're running those this summer. In any case, I'd like to say thank you all again for listening. Hope you enjoyed yourself. Hope you're chill. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.